Hello, dear listeners. Today, once again, we are opening the dusty pages of time. And in the silence of the night, we are setting out on a gentle journey through history. This time our topic is the idea of beauty in the Middle Ages. What did people do back then to be beautiful? How far could they go for the sake of beauty? You'll be surprised. But before we begin, if this channel gives you peace, if it helps you sleep, or if it simply satisfies your curiosity, please take a look at the thank you button under the video. This small support is a big motivation for us. If you are ready, now take a deep breath, close your eyes, and let us begin walking together in the mirror of the past, as the morning sun reflected on the pale surface of the stone-paved courtyard. Genevieve stood upright in front of her mother. She was only 13 years old, but if she was to become the Count's wife one day, she had to attend her first whitening ceremony today. The servants dusted an even paler powder onto her already pale skin. Not a rose colour, but a vein blue dye was pressed onto her cheeks. At last, she was told to open her mouth. When Genevieve hesitantly parted her lips, a woman came closer. With a stick in her hand, she smeared a dark mixture over her teeth. She did not need to look in the mirror. She knew. Her teeth had to be pitch black because her mother had told her, a girl with white skin and black teeth smells like wealth. But in her own reflection, Genevieve saw not beauty, but fear. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, beauty was quite different from today's understanding of aesthetics. While today, healthy skin, bright white teeth, and a natural look are considered symbols of beauty, in that era, these ideas were reversed, because beauty was not only a physical image, it was also a class marker, a cultural symbol, even a way of life, blended with belief. White skin was an indispensable condition of beauty, but this was not a whiteness achieved through nature. It meant the paleness that came with nobility, with not going outside, with a life away from sunlight, while peasants working in the fields tanned. Nobles sat inside their homes and used lead-based powders to whiten their skin even more, even if these powders caused rashes, wounds, and even death over time. The ruthless rules of fashion never changed. Another striking aesthetic standard, alongside white skin, was black teeth, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries. When sugar was still expensive and rare, the teeth of those who consumed sugar often would decay and darken. This rotten appearance was considered a sign of wealth, meaning someone with black teeth was wealthy enough to eat plenty of sweets. The poor, on the other hand, stood out with the bright white healthy teeth, but this was seen as a sign of having no status. Some nobles used substances, like soot, tar, or wine sediment, to darken their teeth by natural means. Sometimes this habit became symbolic, similar to the Ohaguro rituals in Japan. Women darkening their teeth before marriage was considered a traditional sign of beauty. At the same time, this understanding of beauty was not limited to physical appearance. Women with white skin and black teeth were thought to be delicate, graceful, and elite. These descriptions created an artificial boundary separating them from working life, from the sun, from the fields, and therefore from the lower class. Beauty was not natural, it was a privilege that was bought and had to be protected. What is interesting is that this understanding was more flexible for men. Standards about men's skin colour were less strict, but they also tried to show their status by applying powders to their bodies, by wearing gloves on their hands, and by using heavy perfume to hide the traces of sweat and nature. Because bad smell was the smell of the lower class. All of this appearance was not only about physical beauty, it was also an outward expression of respect for God, of loyalty to the class structure, of society, and of suitability to social hierarchy. So when a young girl became beautiful, she was actually representing not only herself, but also the class she belonged to. Unfortunately, these expectations created great pressure on women. The body turned into a battlefield. While lead powders poisoned blood circulation, the chemicals used reduced fertility and caused skin infections. But all this pain was accepted as the price of noble beauty. Over time, sugar became cheaper. It became accessible to everyone. Those whose teeth darkened were no longer only the rich. The poor also became so. This brought the end of the black teeth fashion. In the 17th century, the understanding of aesthetics changed. Whitening teeth became a privilege. White skin was still protected, but now teeth also had to be gleaming. In the same way, this transformation happened, not because the class structure changed, but because economic access changed. When we look back today, the beauty ideal of the past can seem strange, even funny. But in that era, when a girl looked in the mirror, she lived not according to what she saw in her own face, but according to what others would see: white skin, black teeth. These were not only physical details, they were symbols of status, of belonging, of faith, and of obedience. The air carried the coolness of April. But inside the house, the young girl was sweating as she stared into the mirror. In her reflection, the ochred band newly stuck to her forehead stood out. Her mother nodded with satisfaction. The girl noticed that her forehead looked even more open, but she could not understand whether that was beautiful or ugly. While birds chirped outside, inside, a small girl was learning the definition of beauty all over again. In the Renaissance and the centuries after, especially in Western Europe, beauty for women was not only an inborn trait, it was almost a duty that required effort. And one of the most iconic, most surprising beauty practices of this era was forehead widening. The beauty of the forehead was one of the most important criteria of elegance in a period. Women with high, wide, smooth foreheads were associated with nobility and dignity. For this, hair was shaved. In some cases, it was plucked from the root, or the front hair of the head was intentionally forced to shed. Women sometimes used sharp razors, sometimes special lotions, rubbed with a vinegar mixture. For this process, these methods were painful, they irritated, but beauty had a cost, and that cost was paid in silence. Every time women looked in the mirror, they saw not their own faces, but society's expectations. A high-foreheaded face was matched with an intellectual mind. Even artists reflected this understanding. In their paintings, look! The women in Botticelli's Birth of Venus, or Leonardo da Vinci's Le Belle Ferronnier paintings, all have unusually wide foreheads. This was not a coincidence, this was a fashion, and that fashion left psychological marks as much as physical ones. Opening the forehead was not only aesthetic, it was also a sign of obedience and adaptation to the social order. Women did this not only to be beautiful, but also to show the class they belonged to. This behaviour was a silent way of saying, "This is me, I am as you want me to be." In that era, a woman's voice did not rise, but her forehead had to be high. Hair, meanwhile, was a symbol associated with femininity in many cultures. Yet here, a few centimetres of a woman's hair at the forehead was almost considered a shame. Especially young girls raised around the palace, or in noble families, began to open their foreheads the moment they entered adolescence. It was a kind of rite of passage, like a silent celebration of moving from childhood to womanhood. this practice did not remain limited to physical appearance. While women opened their foreheads, they also gave away a part of themselves, sometimes their freedom, sometimes their personality. And the most painful part was that this sacrifice was often never noticed, neither in the books of the past nor in the pages of history written by men did the beauty effort find a place, but in women's faces, in their eyes, in their cells, its traces always remained. Over time, this fashion changed. When a new queen arrived, or when a painter searched for a different aesthetic, foreheads were covered again with hair. But even if these temporary fashions changed, the social pressures women faced stayed in place, because the issue was not only hair, it was belonging, fitting in, submitting, pledging obedience. When we look back today, behind this beauty ideal, that seems strange to us. There is a much deeper story. Women giving up their bodies for the sake of beauty, living by the invisible rules of society, and accepting all of this without questioning. This was the real truth. Behind the foreheads, maybe that day, the little girl looking in the mirror was not only opening her forehead, she was also opening her future. Without realizing it, in every centimetre where her hair fell, she was disappearing a little more. If this narration affected you, to trace together the marks of pains that are invisible but felt throughout history, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and support us with the thank you button below, because history is sometimes hidden in a lock of hair. Now let us continue. The soul mirror was trembling in her hands. The morning light by the window was falling directly onto her face. The young woman looked one last time at the tweezers she held. Her mother's voice rang in my ear. A graceful woman does not have eyebrows. Then she took a deep breath and began to pluck, one by one, carefully, almost as if worshipping. Not her eyebrows. She was hurting herself, in fact, but she could not tell anyone, because this was the silent burden of beauty. From the late Middle Ages to the Renaissance, even to the Victorian era, in Europe, the female body was shaped according to the norms drawn by society. The aesthetic understanding of these periods determined not only fashion, but also a woman's place in society, her position, and even her silence. One of the most striking practices was women plucking out their eyebrows completely. While today, a modern woman's beauty routine is based on defining thickening or shaping the eyebrows in past centuries. The ideal beauty understanding was the exact opposite. For a refined, obedient, and unobtrusive face, a browless forehead was almost the golden rule. Eyebrows were seen as the symbol, expression of resistance and of character. For this reason, a woman having no eyebrows made her perceived as more docile, more feminine, and more obedient, especially for noble women. This practice signalled not only beauty, but also status, dignity, and proper upbringing. A browless face also showed that the woman could devote time and money to her care. Because this process required constant maintenance, it would be plucked again, at least a few times a week, or sometimes vinegar or herbal mixtures were used to try to prevent roots from growing back. However, this practice left not only physical but also the psychological marks. Having no eyebrows, in a way, caused the woman to carry a face that was unreactive, expressionless, and did not show emotions, and that was exactly what was desired. A woman who did not show emotion, who existed only to be looked at like a painting, but a painting that did not speak, did not resist. Artists, painters did not hesitate to reflect this aesthetic understanding either. When you look at Renaissance paintings, women's portraits with browless or almost invisible eyebrows stand out because this was not only fashion, it was the outward expression of a mentality. As a woman's expression was erased, her voice also decreased, and when a woman fell silent, society was considered more peaceful. So what did women feel? Some accepted this process. Mothers taught their daughters this tradition. They would say that the first step to being a graceful woman passed through her eyebrows, but deep inside, some felt the pain. Every plucked hair was diminishing herself a little more. Every look into the mirror was seeing again the mould society had shaped for them. Moreover, this was not only for nobles. Over time, middle-class women also began to imitate this fashion because beauty did not come only from birth. It required effort and the price of being the way society wanted, sometimes started with tweezers and continued with years of silence. This practice disappearing over time became possible not because the understanding of beauty changed, but because women slowly began to claim their own expressions. Eyebrows came back, expressions appeared. Women began to speak, but in the dusty pages of history, those silent, expressionless, browless faces that once existed tell us not only how women had to look in that era, but also how they should not have to look today. A few touches, made with an eyebrow pencil, could have been a symbol of resistance in the past, because beauty is sometimes a weapon, sometimes a chain, sometimes a tool of silencing. And in this story, eyebrows are not just hair, they're accession resistance and the traces of an invisible struggle. A young woman was standing in front of the closed window. In her hand, there was a silk corset. Her mother was preparing to dress her in it. Her mother smiled. A graceful woman does not breathe. She has her breath taken away. She tightened the corset a little more. The young girl's ribs sank inward, but her mother was pleased. Her waist was now within a single hand. It is hard to describe what Victorian women sacrificed to look elegant, because this sacrifice is not only physical, it is also like a social and psychological chain, and the metal link of that chain was undoubtedly the corset. Instead of the comfortable, flexible fabrics that come to mind today, when we say underwear, the first thing women of that era put on, as soon as they woke up in the morning, was a corset. It was made of thick fabrics, reinforced with steel boning, squeezing the body like a sculpture. But this sculpture was alive, and with every breath, it was being crushed more and more. The purpose of corsets was not only to make the waist slimmer, it was to lift the chest, to push the shoulders back, to keep a woman's posture inside the frame of proper manners, and most importantly, to force the body into an ideal female shape. That ideal was often not even realistic. A tightened waist could cause the organs to shift, the lungs to be compressed, even the ribs to crack, creating serious health problems. Even the doctors of the time were helpless about it. Many young girls were trapped in these tight corsets before their bones were fully developed, and this could prevent their growth. The ribs sometimes became permanently deformed, and yet, against all this damage, society had only one reaction: how elegant you look. In truth, that elegance was a kind of invisible captivity. Women became strangers to their own bodies. They felt pain while sitting. They were afraid to take a deep breath. Circulation slowed. Pressure was placed on the stomach. Fainting became normal. That is why, in Victorian literature and paintings, there are so many fainting women, sometimes from emotion, sometimes from lack of air, but the reason was the same: the corset. And these corsets were not only worn by women, they were also considered a symbol of how well a woman had been raised. When a little girl was introduced to her first corset by her mother, she was no longer considered a child, because being a woman meant getting used to pain. It meant learning to be tightened in silence and to endure with a smile. And this pressure was not only physical, it was also social. A woman who did not wear a corset could be labelled as loose, improper, or a bad example to others. In society, a woman was judged not only by her shape, but also by her obedience to that shape. That is why corsets were not just clothing, they were a symbol of discipline. But everything had a limit. As the world moved closer to the 20th century, women began to rebel. As women's rights movements rose, women had to break those metal circles first in order to become the owner of their own bodies. We want to breathe, voices began to rise. Women realised they did not have to die just to look elegant. And in the end, the corset stopped being only a fashion element. It gave its place to more flexible, healthier, freer alternatives. But history still whispers those tight torture tools, covered in silk, reinforced with narrow steel bones. Each whisper sounds like the crack of a rib in the ear. With every remembering, a woman breathes again. Because today, women deserve not only to breathe, but also to live inside their own bodies. And every corset should be remembered as the symbol of a moment when a woman had to fight with her own identity. Being elegant no longer has to mean being in pain. A woman gliding down the steps of a cathedral stopped. Her eyes were on the ground, but everyone else's eyes were on her hat. That strange headpiece, rising from both sides of her head, almost high enough to strike windows, looked like the wing of a bird floating in the air. As the wind blew, it swayed, and she carried it carefully through curious stares. But no one asked whether she could breathe or how her neck endured the weight. Because that hat was not only decoration, it was status. These hats that left their mark on the late Middle Ages, especially the late Gothic period, were called the hennin. But among the people, they had other names too: devil horns, women's towers, or the headpiece of closeness to the sky. To some, it was a symbol of elegance. To others, it was proof that arrogant nobles had lost their minds to fashion. The truth is, these hats were not only a trend, they were also a social declaration. Hennin hats were usually cone-shaped, but some were designed like horns, with two ends reaching upward. They could be made from about 20 centimetres to almost 1 metre in height. The veils made of tulle or lace that completed the hat sometimes reached all the way to the ground, and women looked as if they were carrying a tower on top of their heads. These showy headpieces were worn just by women who wanted to show that they belonged to the upper class, because the size of the hat, the quality of the fabric that the jewel decorations used, gave a direct message about that woman's social rank. The bigger it was, the richer she was, the more decorated it was, the more noble she seemed. It was an elegant way of saying, I am here and you are not. But this fashion brought many difficulties with it. Hennins were so bulky and so high that women had to bend to pass through doorways, and on windy days they needed servants to help protect their hats. In some periods, churches even tried to ban them, deciding they were distracting. But bans only applied to common people. For nobles, fashion was higher, even than God's law. And the physical strain was another matter. Special collar corsets were used to support the neck. Hair was styled for hours, and hidden pin systems were built so that the veils would fall perfectly. All that effort was for only one thing: to be looked at 5 minutes longer at an evening ball. And more than that, these hats stirred reactions too against society's obsession with fashion. For the lower classes, these headpieces could even mean challenging them. Some preachers linked them to the sin of pride and cursed women wearing such headpieces as a display of arrogance and vanity. But like every era, this fashion also passed. As the 16th century approached, hennins were replaced by lower headpieces, bonnets and hats. Women kept their heads not close to the sky, but closer to the ground. And still, these hats, left behind in paintings and stories, continue to surprise us centuries later. Today we might smile at those tall hats, but for a woman of that time, it was not something ridiculous. It was identity. Wearing it was a way to say, "This is me," without speaking. And perhaps the only place where a woman could be visible to society was the very top of her head. On one foggy morning in England, a woman looked into the mirror. Under her eyes, there were bruised shadows. On her forehead, fine wrinkles, on her cheeks, faint spots left by the sun. She did not like the image she saw. She had been taught that the measure of beauty was a face as white as snow. She opened a lilac-coloured bottle. From inside, she drew out a liquid, milky in texture, with a faint metallic scent. She dipped her finger and spread it over her cheeks. In that moment, all she felt was cold. But days later, the thing that would burn not only her skin, but also her spirit, had already begun right there. In the Victorian era, women's understanding of beauty was very different from today. In that time, for a woman to be considered beautiful, she did not need to be tan, she needed to be pale, because paleness was the sign of delicacy, purity, and belonging to the noble class. Tanned skin was the trace of labour, of poor lives lived under the sun. So for aristocratic women, or women who wanted to look aristocratic, white skin was essential, and to achieve it, methods far from natural entered the scene. At the head of those methods was a chemical mixture called ceruse. It was made from substances like vinegar and lead carbonate, meaning women were applying lead to their faces. Ceruse made the skin look temporarily bright, smooth, and porcelain-like, but at the same time, it burned the skin from within, clogged pores, killed skin cells. Over time, it could even lead to jaw decay and teeth falling out. And interestingly, this lead-based makeup was not only common among lower-class women, it was also widespread around royal courts. It is even said that Queen Elizabeth of the Tudor era often used this substance to keep her skin very white, and over the years, her skin became almost wax-like. The cracks on the Queen's face were reflected, even in paintings of the period, and still she continued to be seen as the peak of elegance. But lead did not remain only on the skin. It seeped under the skin, mixed into the blood, and over time damaged the nervous system. As use continued, women began to experience headaches, vision problems, shortness of breath, and even miscarriages. But the problem was not only the poison, it was the poisonous structure of the beauty ideal. The whiteness standard society demanded from women was so powerful that they believed the path leading to death was the path leading to beauty. Over time, the harms of ceruse were also proven scientifically, but this did not stop its use immediately, because beauty was not defined by knowledge, it was defined by gazes. Women risked their bodies openly in order to gain a share of those gazes. They accepted decay in front of mirrors, decorated with lead. And this whitening obsession was not limited to makeup. Some drinks and herbal mixtures were also marketed with the claim that they could make the skin paler.
Sis, bish!
Inside these mixtures, there were substances like opium, arsenic, and mercury, meaning women were poisoning not only their faces, but also their organs. Today, on the market shelves, where we choose cosmetic products back then, they faced laboratory disasters. For women of that era, beauty was not only something seen in the mirror, it was the only way to survive, to marry, to be accepted in society. To look beautiful meant to live, and that is why they could go so far as to give up even their lives. And when we bring this story into today, what do we see? Perhaps we do not apply lead to our faces now, but we have digital ceruse, filters, obsession with perfection, glowing setting trends, appearing every day. Lead may not come out of boxes anymore, but it is still spread onto our minds. Humans have their chaste beauty throughout history, but sometimes the price of beauty was strong enough and to cover even the smell of death. The white faces, brightened with lead in the Victorian era, are telling us something. Elegance can sometimes be toxic, and every era that accepts the definition of beauty without questioning produces its own lead. In a mirrored castle, there was a woman holding a silver-handled comb, brushing her hair. Her white skin was beneath layers of dry powder and perfume. Her servant approached, carrying a jug of water and soap. Just as she was about to set them down, the woman raised her eyebrows slightly. "Do not touch," she said. "I will receive guests today." The servant silently pulled the water back, because she knew in that house there was not water and soap. There was rose oil and chalk, and more importantly, being clean did not always mean being elegant. As strange as it seems today, it is surprising to see that the concepts of cleanliness and beauty have not always gone together throughout history, especially in Europe, from the late Middle Ages through the Renaissance and into the Victorian era. Being clean was often seen as a lower-class habit. In palaces, noble mansions, and grand balls, while perfumes floated in the air, it was known hands and faces were not washed for weeks. For the noble class, water was suspicious, because according to the common medical beliefs of the time, water opened the pores and made it easier for diseases to enter the body. So washing, especially bathing, was seen as a dangerous activity. And heating water, carrying it, preparing it, was a luxury. It required servants. So instead of cleanliness, the upper class created alternatives. And the first of those alternatives was perfume. Lavender, rose oil, musk, strong scents were rubbed often onto unwashed parts of the body. Clothes were perfumed, and even rooms were filled with incense burners. Scent had replaced cleanliness. Being elegant meant smelling good. But what was hidden under that scent was not spoken about. Powders and makeup served the same purpose. Body powders, face powders, tinted creams were used to cover dirt and skin damage. Women lived for weeks without washing their faces, adding only new layers. Hair was brushed but not washed. Special scented combs and brushes were made not to remove oil, but to spread it. For servants and the lower classes, the situation was very different. They were close to water because they worked, they sweated, they spent time outside. This made washing necessary. How ironic. The ones seen as dirty were often cleaner, and the ones called elegant were hidden behind scents. Elegance and cleanliness had become so separate Even in times when disease spread everywhere, the upper class kept their distance from bathing. During plague periods in many parts of Europe, public baths were closed. This reduced access to water for ordinary people. But for the aristocracy, the excuse was ready. Water spreads disease. This fear left a strong impact, especially among women. Some diaries from the era describe in detail women living for months without washing their bodies, using only perfumes and makeup. Clothing had a similar contradiction. Layered dresses were not washed. Underclothes were not changed often. Lace, scarves, brooches were used to add elegance on top of dirty fabric. The look became a sign of social status. The clothes did not need to be clean as long as they looked showy and expensive. But these habits brought health problems too. Skin diseases, lice, irritation, and contagious illnesses were common, and still these issues were not discussed publicly, so that the image of nobility would not be damaged, because admitting it was necessary that for elegance, people had made peace with dirt. Over time, science advanced, germ theory emerged. Especially in the second half of the 19th century, cleanliness began to matter more, but even that transformation moved slowly, because breaking an idea was harder than cleaning a body. When we look back today, we see that cleanliness is tied not only to soap and water, but also to a value, and that value changes by era. In the Victorian period, cleanliness was linked with peasantry, illness, simplicity, while dirt was intertwined with power, elegance, and status. Perhaps the most striking truth was this: society did not cleanse people with water, it cleansed them with a gaze. In the dim streets of the town, at night, the only sound echoing was the muffled cry, "Young girl." She pressed her hand tightly and into her mother's palm and closed her eyes. In a small room, like a kitchen behind the house, an old woman heated a thin needle in the fire, then dipped it into sooty ink. When she pressed it into the girl's skin, the mother's lips moved softly like a prayer, because this pain was not only pain, it was the pain of a tradition, of a community, of belonging. That tattoo was not only a shape, it was part of life. When we look at history through today's aesthetic lens, it may be surprising, but beauty has long been closely tied to pain. Tattoos, piercings, body punctures, and similar methods were not only for decoration. They were also a mark of identity, social acceptance, an expression of belief, and sometimes an act of defiance. But each time they were painful. Beauty was a struggle, written under the skin. Ancient societies were not strangers to piercing and tattooing. In ancient Egypt, women pierced their navels. This was seen as a symbol of fertility and closeness to the gods. But the piercing method were far from today's sterile practices. Bone fragments, bronze needles, fish spines were used only to look beautiful. To ease the pain, prayers were spoken. Burning herbs were used to smoke the air. Sometimes lullabies were sung to little girls so they could drift away from the pain. Tattoos were an honor badge for warriors, a mark of ownership for slaves and for women, sometimes only a seal showing they had reached marriage age. In Roman times, some slaves were tattooed, even on their foreheads, a symbol of humiliation rather than beauty, and yet, among northern tribes, tattoos were considered sacred and attractive. The black motifs, stretching from the wrists to the necks of Viking women, made them seem privileged and untouchable. Each needle strike added another layer of value. In the Middle Ages, things changed a little. The church considered any intervention on the body an insult to the body created by God. Tattooing and piercing were labelled as devilish. But among the people, these traditions continued underground, especially among nomadic communities. For example, among Romani groups, ear, nose, or lip piercings remained signs of beauty and belonging. Some women, after marriage, even began to carry their husband's name or clan symbols as tattoos. In the Victorian era, as modern medicine developed, pain became a little more bearable. But the irony was this: as pain decreased, the meaning of piercing began to change. It stopped being a necessity and became a luxury and a display. English aristocratic women secretly visited tattoo artists and had delicate designs placed under their shoulders or on their ankles, but it had to remain hidden, because in public it was still seen as tasteless and lower-class imitation. Piercings had a special place in turning pain into aesthetics. In some societies, lip piercings meant a vow of silence, while in others they were seen as increasing sexual attraction. Nose rings, from India to the Middle East, were symbols of both beauty and wealth. But we must remember these ornaments passed through wounds opened by needles, infections, inflammation, lasting pain. Beauty had a price, and for women, that price was often paid silently, because society's command to be beautiful was shaped at the tip of a needle. Grandmothers pierced their granddaughters' ears while they were still children, saying, "A girl without earrings will be left widowed," and they mixed pain into tradition. Beauty was resisting pain and proving strength, both in spirit and in body. When we look at all of this today, it may seem like suffering only for aesthetics, but it held a much deeper meaning. Needle and beauty were reflections of belonging, of culture, and of a silent resistance. Women became stronger as they pierced, more visible as they were tattooed. Every mark was a story, and these stories were written for centuries, with a needle into skin. Behind closed doors, a whisper spread. Even when women spoke among themselves, they hesitated to say certain words openly. They implied them. When someone said, "That woman dresses too openly," what she meant was often not cleavage or a short skirt. It was an ankle showing, because in the past, when a woman showed her ankle, it was not only improper, it was also considered provocative. A man's glance catching on a woman's ankle could become an event scandalous enough to split the veins of honour in society. It looked like a harmless piece of the bee seen from the edge of lace, and yet it represented one of the greatest suppressed desires in history, the covered history of foot fetishism. From the Middle Ages to the Victorian era, the female body was controlled by being broken into parts. Arms were covered, chests were pressed down with corsets, hair was hidden with scarves, and then it was the feet. The more society suppressed women, the more what was suppressed grew, and among those suppressed areas, feet became one of the strongest, because the more something is forbidden, the more its allure multiplies. The Victorian era was one of the times when these prohibitions became the most refined and the sharpest. Women had to hide their feet under long skirts. Even showing the tip of a shoe while walking could be seen as improper. Fashion magazines of the time criticised inappropriate walking styles. They advised women not to take large steps. That could make the skirt open. The ankle had become an object of imagination for men, because it was not seen and everything unseen is forced to grow inside imagination. Shoes became part of this fantasy too. Lace-trimmed, buckled, silk-covered narrow shoes were produced not only for beauty, but also as symbols of desire. Some men even made a habit of stealing women's shoes. This was not only theft, it was a distorted expression of suppressed desire. The foot inside the shoe was never fully seen, but it was imagined. So the shoe was both hiding and implying. In the East, especially in China, this idea went to an extreme. With a tradition called lotus feet, girls' feet were bound, broken, and reduced. The goal was not only aesthetic. Small feet meant an obedient woman. A foot curled in pain was also the symbol of a suppressed spirit. And even this painful deformation was once accepted as a proper sexual attraction. In Western societies, because feet were linked directly to desire, they were kept hidden. Some moralists preached, when a woman shows her feet, she creates provocative fantasies in the man's mind. They advised women to lower their heads while walking and to tug their wide skirts down. A single moment of visibility could lead some men to write love letters and could lead some women to be excluded from society. An ankle, a stocking, a buckled shoe, all of it was seen as something that had to be controlled. Even inside the home, it was not very different. Women did not walk barefoot. Even beside their husbands, they wore stockings because bare feet were equal to nakedness. Foot baths were private rituals done only with the help of servants. A woman hid even her own feet like a secret that should not be revealed. This was not only covering the body, it was covering desire. Foot fetishism was born as an indirect result of this pressure. Like everything suppressed, becoming fantasy, feet became a symbol of desire. In French literature, English romantic poetry and German painting, the hidden foot image appears again and again, and most of all it appears in dance scenes. A skirt lifting while dancing, and an ankle seen for 1 second. That 1 second could represent the entire sexuality of an era. Today, fantasies about feet may look like individual preferences, but in truth, they evolved as a culture formed by hundreds of years of suppressed aesthetic ideals. Because throughout history, beauty was not shown freely, it was presented by being covered. And what is covered always returns in another way. One morning, in the streets of Paris, the lace-covered hand of an aristocratic woman, hanging from her window, caught attention. With an elegant wrist movement, she moved a small glass bottle over her neck, behind her ear, and toward her chest. The city was just beginning to breathe, but she had already dressed herself in scents. This was not her cleanliness, it was her way of showing her social place. Because in that era, washing with water required courage. Soap was a luxury, and even water was a habit viewed with suspicion. Cleanliness was measured not by wiping away sweat, but by drowning out smell, from the dark corridors of the Middle Ages to the glittering mirrors of Renaissance palaces, and even under the enormous hats of the Victorian era, one thing did not change. People hid behind scents instead of washing. Cleanliness was represented not by appearance, but by fragrance. The body was not scrubbed with soap. Instead, rose oil, amber, musk, and similar aromas were poured over it. The more expensive a woman smelled, the more noble she was assumed to be. So smelling good became not only hygiene, but a class identity. Soap, especially in the periods when it was made from animal fat and ash, was known for its unpleasant smell and was seen as a rough material used only by the lower classes. Cities had almost no access to clean water. Canals served as both sewage and drinking water. In such an environment, washing was almost like an invitation to illness. People masked their sweat, body odours and skin problems, not with water, but with scents. That is why the perfume industry was born and grew rapidly. Especially in France, cities like Grasse became the perfume centre of the world. Rose, jasmine, lavender, orange blossom, all were distilled into small glass bottles and rubbed onto the bodies of queens, dukes, and countesses. But this was not a luxury only for the aristocracy. The lower parts of society also began to create their own scents. Dried herbs, flower essences, extracts mixed with alcohol, all of it was like a veil laid over sweat and dirt. There was no cleansing, only the art of covering. Perfumes were also seen as protection against disease, and in some times, people would hold a handkerchief under their noses and drip rose oil, clove or vinegar into it. It was a ritual believed to prevent bad smells from entering and to keep illness away, because the miasma theory dominated that era. Diseases spread through foul odours, so smelling good was seen not only as social, but also as a medical defence. But behind these scents, there was a suppressed truth. When the human body goes unwashed for months, no matter how expensive the perfume used to cover it, that natural reality still seeps through, especially in crowded balls, theatre halls, church services, where hundreds of unwashed bodies gathered. Even the most beautiful fragrance could become suffocating. So choosing a scent became almost like a diplomatic strategy. Who you sat beside, which essence you used, which social message you sent, everything was part of a theatre. Women, instead of washing their hair, sprinkled flour to dull it, then perfumed it by dripping lavender oil. Men, specially sprinkled scented powders inside their wigs. Wigs were not removed for weeks, scents were refreshed for weeks, but water never touched them, because water meant illness, and soap was crude, and, for the poor, the image of cleanliness was the crystal bottle of perfume. Some women on special days made their scents even stronger by applying drops to hidden areas, behind the knees or inside the elbows, because those areas stayed warm and the scent spread more powerfully. These small details showed both a woman's personal sense of aesthetics and her social intelligence. So a scent was not only an essence, it could be a message, an invitation, a hint. Today, lavender or jasmine may smell pleasant to us, but in those times, it was a mask. It was a sensory illusion of a life far from cleanliness, of a culture shaped by the absence of hygiene. And yet, that illusion was so convincing that even in lives without soap, people could feel elegant, clean, and noble. In short, scents were used in the past not only to be beautiful, but to look clean, to protect from illness, and to signal class. There was no soap, but there was perfume. And perfume was not only a pleasant smell trapped in a bottle, it was a way of living, belonging to an entire era. There was a mirror, gold-gilded, its enormous frame darkened with time, like a silent witness that judged whoever looked into it against time itself. Every morning, the woman who stood before that mirror carried the same question on her face. Should I look thinner, or does being a little more full look more noble? This was not a question belonging to a modern woman. It was an uncertainty that occupied the minds of dozens of women, from the Middle Ages to the Victorian era, changing by age, but never disappearing. Because the idea of beauty was not only about aesthetics, it was a sign of class, of lifestyle, even of belief. With today's eyes, nobility and fatness are rarely placed side by side, but history is full of examples rich enough to surprise us. Especially in the Middle Ages and the Baroque period, being fat was a sign of wealth and power. The richness of the table, the ability to consume meat and sweets in abundance, was a privilege only the elite could access. Every extra kilo on the body was a clear sign of, I do not work, I am not in the fields, I sit and I eat. Thinness was associated with poverty. Sharp facial bones, sunken cheeks, narrow shoulders, these were signs of illness and hardship. Nobles were plump because they could eat freely. They could make servants dance even if they did not. They could stay at the top of society without moving. That is why when you look at paintings of the era, especially women are portrayed with rounded lines, full bodies, thick arms and short necks. But over time, things changed. After the Renaissance, Europe's aesthetic understanding began to shift, especially with French fashion. Slenderness and grace came forward. This was a period when thinness slowly started to become a symbol of beauty. But this thinness was not pursued in gyms or through diet lists. As it is today, it was seen more like a sickly romance. Pale skin, thin wrists, a slightly hunched posture, these represented a graceful and fragile woman, especially in the Victorian era. This understanding hardened. But women did not seek healthy ways to lose weight. They sought ways to make themselves ill for the sake of fashion. They held their breath with corsets. They pressed their ribs inward. Sometimes they tightened their bodies so much that they damaged their internal organs. Because a thin waist had become the symbol of aristocracy, a belief dominated the era. The thinner you are, the more noble you are. But the irony was this. For men, it was the opposite. They still considered the ideal body to be broad-shouldered, thick-thighed, strong-looking. Women had to be delicate, men had to be imposing. Even the aesthetic understanding of the time was shaped by gender. The less space a woman took up, the more she was considered a woman. The more space a man took up, the stronger he was considered. This shaped both the visual culture and clothing. While women walked in layered skirts and waist-tightening corsets, men displayed themselves with wide coats, puffed trousers, and large hats. In some periods, a reverse movement appeared. For example, in the post-revolution period in late 18th century France, bourgeois women who wanted to align with the people turned thinness into a protest. The full women of the past were replaced by frail free spirits. This time extreme thinness signalled an intellectual and revolutionary stance. But it did not last long. Fashion turned again and fullness became popular once more. Another striking point was the relationship between pregnancy and weight. In older eras, a woman looking fuller was seen as a symbol of fertility. Many women, even when not pregnant, tried to create that look with corsets that enlarged the chest, and pads that made the hips appear wider, because a woman who could give birth was considered valuable in society. So fullness was also presented as a feminine virtue. But no matter what, one thing remained the same. A woman's body was always being forced into a shape. Sometimes it had to be thick, sometimes thin, sometimes dazzling, sometimes barely visible. But it always had to serve a purpose, and what that purpose was not decided by fashion magazines. It was decided by those who sat on thrones. Today, this past perception of weight may seem strange, but in the conditions of that day, the meaning a body carried still forms the foundation of many beauty standards, even now, so the answer is still not clear: fatness or thinness, beauty or health. Maybe the real issue is this: a woman's weight was never only hers. She stood in front of an old mirror. In the silence of the night, she looked at her hands for a long time. Her fingers were almost nothing but bone, thin, graceful, but pale. Her wrists were bare. Veins blinked beneath the skin, like thin blue roads. As she put on the lace gloves her servant brought, she asked her reflection, "Do I look noble?" This was the question thousands of women once asked, in the morning mirror, because nobility was more than a title. It was a way of behaving, a posture, an aesthetic rule, reaching even into the shape of the body. Today, Hands are often parts we do not pay attention to, but in past centuries, a woman's hands were symbols that told which class she belonged to, how she lived, and how valuable she was, especially in the Victorian era and in aristocratic classes before it. Long fingers, very white skin, and thin wrists were like an invisible seal of feminine nobility. So why were hands so important? Because hands revealed a woman's daily life. Hands that had worked in the fields were thick, cracked, darkened by the sun. Servants had calluses on their hands. Those who sewed had rough fingertips, but an aristocratic woman did no work. Her hand had to be soft as a pillow. Her fingers had to be long and delicate, like piano keys. She ruled not with her hand, but with her gaze. That is why hands were protected with great care. When going into the sun, special gloves were worn. Lemon juice was used to whiten hands. At night, hands wrapped in creams were wrapped in cloth, and softness was protected until morning. In winter, women even hid their hands inside their cloaks while walking outside so they would not crack. Thin wrists were the finest detail of beauty. A place a man looked at carefully, a mother wanted to see in her daughter. A painter reflected with the most delicate brushstrokes. Thin wrists represented feminine fragility. And of course, the thinner the wrist, the more delicate the woman was believed to be. So lace bracelets, elegant watch straps, gold bangles were used to emphasize that grace. The elegance of hands and wrists also had to be supported by behavior. Women should not throw their hands behind their heads. Fingers should never reach for something in a hurry. A cup lifted with fingertips, a book page turned gently, a touch on a flower. These showed how a woman had been educated. And that was part of womanhood. How you used your hand showed who you were. Still, reaching that ideal look was not always easy. There were even wooden moulds used to stretch fingers to look longer. Gloves were produced so tight that a woman had to force her hand into them with difficulty, because the tighter the glove, the smaller and more delicate the hand appeared. It was suffering, done only for aesthetics, but a woman complaining was not welcomed. Elegance had to join with silence. This beauty obsession was more universal than it seems. Small feet in China, long fingers in Europe. Both were outward expressions of similar codes. Shaping the body was one of the symbolic ways to control women, and also a way to make class differences more visible. Some women, even if not noble, tried to step into that role with their hands. They rubbed their hands with lemon. At night, they tried to soften them with potato peels, but if there were black marks under the nails, no matter how beautiful the hands looked, it revealed the nobility was false. Over time, these aesthetic codes changed. After the Industrial Revolution, hands became the symbol of labour. A woman's strong hands began to represent her independence, but the grace of a thin-wristed hand was never forgotten. That hand, in a woman holding the corner of a notebook, in a young girl folding a letter, or in a noble woman lifting a glass, always whispered the same thing. I am refined, I am elegant, I rule without being seen. And the smile on the face of a woman today, made happy by comments like, your hands are so beautiful, may be the quiet echo of centuries of aesthetic inheritance. If even the simplest part of a woman's body once determined her class, her value, and her womanhood, then we can realise that many judgments made today based on appearance still carry the shadow of those days. The morning light slipping through the window had not yet met the sleepy city. The young girl, the moment she woke, turned her face toward the covered mirror. She slowly opened the small box in her hand. Inside was a mixture made from crushed saffron, dried roses, and gold dust. With her fingertips, she gently applied it to her face. She smiled, looking at the mirror. Her face was glowing, but not only from gold. Beauty in that era was not just visual approval. Beauty was a divine balance, a social class sign, and a ritual that shaped a woman's fate. Today, it is easy to find mascara, foundation, lipstick on cosmetic shelves. But in past centuries, beauty products came directly from nature, were blended with rituals, and often became mysterious mixtures only the wealthy could reach. These rituals were done not only to increase physical beauty, but also as a tool for spiritual cleansing or social acceptance. For example, kohl applied to nails was not only for the eyes, it was used to enhance the elegance of hands as well. Kohl, besides making the eyes appear larger, also made nails look darker and more defined. It was a sign that a person was both attentive to care and cultured. This tradition survived in Egypt, in Rome, and even in Ottoman palaces. Gold dust was the most luxurious representative of beauty. Finely ground gold particles were often mixed with honey and applied to the face. This did not only brighten the skin, it also gave the woman a radiant look, as if she carried light. In the Renaissance, this practice became so popular that some women never left gold out of their daily routine. And yet, it was also a status symbol. Not everyone had gold at home. A woman who put gold on her face was almost shouting that she was noble. Alongside kohl and gold dust, other materials were also used in beauty rituals. Crushed pearl powder for whitening the skin, saffron for hiding under-eye darkness, rose oil for smoothing the skin. But what stood out was that these practices did not stay limited to physical change. These rituals were almost a meditation. While a woman made herself beautiful, she also turned inward, thinking of her past, her fate, her dreams. In some societies, these rituals carried religious meanings too. In India, the bindi placed on the forehead was not only decoration, it was the expression of the third eye. In old Anatolian cultures, brides drew motifs on their faces and hands on the morning of the wedding, wishing for abundance and happiness through those lines. So beauty was often a wish, a prayer, a form of protection. Of course, some of these rituals became harmful over time. Lead-based face powders, arsenic beauty lotions, mercury-mixed ointments, women lost their health just to look beautiful. But the moulds drawn for them by society were so strict, they often endured the pains and sealants. Because if a woman was not beautiful, she was not seen as a good wife, a respected individual, a valuable being. This pressure was not only for the rich. Even peasant women developed their own rituals. Mixtures made at home with turmeric, milk, honey were applied to the skin at night and left until morning. Hair was combed with rose water. Teeth were cleaned with ash. Every class created its own beauty codes. But there was a detail and wheel that mattered. The ritual was shaped not only by ingredients, but also by intention. Women did not always do these care moments alone. Sometimes with their mothers, sometimes with sisters, they shared the process. In that time, stories were told, secrets were whispered, hopes were spoken aloud. Beauty became a moment of cleansing and solidarity. Today, beauty rituals are much more accessible, but women still stand in front of the mirror and ask the same question: am I beautiful like this? Maybe the answer is not in gold dust, but in sincerity, in the courage to be alone with yourself in that moment. Because in every era, beauty has been not an illusion, but a narrative. And that narrative has been written by women's hands, patiently and with hope. A foggy morning, footsteps echoing on stone streets, a 13-year-old girl, under the scarf on her head, with the tip of her hair showing, a blazing red, a living flame, eyes watching, from closed windows, multiplying. One person makes the sign of the cross, another murmurs a prayer. Her mother holds her hand tightly, but the girl knows. Something will happen because of her hair, It had happened before, but she only loved how her hair danced with the wind. People saw that dance as a threat. Throughout history, red hair was never only a colour, it was a symbol, feared, desired, blessed, and cursed at the same time. Why? Because it was rare. Like everything rare, it drew attention. And like everything that draws attention, it invited danger, especially for women. In medieval Europe, red-haired women were associated with witchcraft. In Inquisition records, a significant number of those burned as witches were red-haired, because that colour broke society's expectations. Dark-haired women were seen as obedient, blondes as innocent, while redheads were seen as rebellious, tempting, defiant, even demonic. Some regions even believed red hair was the mark of the devil. Religious leaders described this hair colour directly as a sign of the demon in their sermons. But there was another side, especially in the world of art. Red hair was often portrayed as seductive and enchanting. In Renaissance paintings, in Dante's Divine Comedy, Beatrice's hair was deep red. Venetian painter Titian painted red-haired women so often that the term Titian red was born. So it was possible to be both a witch and a muse. The name of the paradox was red hair. In England, this perception took another form. Queen Elizabeth was red-haired. During her reign, red hair almost became a royal symbol. Nobles tried to lighten and redden their children's hair by washing it with ginger, because having that colour was no longer only a curse, it was also a sign of power and prestige. But among the people, it did not spread the same way, because the street writes one set of rules and the palace writes another. This duality placed the heaviest burden on women, a natural trait loaded with supernatural meaning, forced them into a struggle with their hair. Some hid it, some dyed it, some turned it into a symbol of resistance, because along with their hair, the gazes were on them too. One gaze made them the object of desire, another placed them on a target with hostility. In some areas, people believed red-haired babies should be cleansed immediately after birth. Amulets were tied to them. Holy water was sprinkled. Some legends claimed this hair glowed at night, tied its owner to moonlight, or gave the ability to cast spells. Far from reality, but powerful because people are quick to demonize what they cannot understand. Even in the modern era, this historical burden on red hair did not fully disappear. In media, literature, films, red-haired characters are still presented as different, charismatic, dangerous, or seductive. This shows the images carved into our subconscious are still there. And yet, hair is only hair. But society turns it into a symbol. Today, red hair is being reinterpreted as originality and courage. People choose this colour willingly, wear it proudly, display it with confidence. But it was not easy to reach this point. Behind it, there are centuries of false beliefs, unfair punishments, burned bodies, excluded people. Maybe that is why red hair is still the most beautiful form of defiance. Because it is not only pigment, it is a story. And that story is the quiet but strong voice of surviving, of being yourself, and of being proud of difference. On a Sunday morning, while bell sounds echo from far away, a young woman in a tiny mirror tries to draw a black line carefully around her eyes, a little colour on her cheeks, a soft shine on her lips. Just as she is about to step outside, her mother grabs her arm. "What are you doing? Did you decorate your eyes? This is disrespect to God." The woman lowers her head, and as she wipes off her makeup, the sentence slips from her lips. "But I just wanted to feel a little beautiful." In Europe, in the Victorian era and just before it, there was a strange tension between beauty ideals and religiosity. A visible decoration like eye makeup could be accepted only in certain spaces and social contexts. But the church was not one of them. On the contrary, a woman going to church was expected to be as plain, colourless, almost invisible as possible, because appearing before God while adorned was associated with showiness, pride, even lust. Eye makeup had carried different meanings throughout history. In ancient Egypt, it was a protective ritual. In ancient Rome, it was a status symbol. But from the Middle Ages onward, under Christian influence, a great distance formed towards such practices. The idea was simple. If the body was created by God, then changing it too boldly could look like pride, and pride was always suspicious. A woman's sea, especially her eyes, became a quiet battlefield between devotion and display. In many places, the church did not ban makeup with a single official law. Instead, it shaped people through sermons, through glances, through the soft pressure of neighbours. The rules lived in the air, not always on paper, and when rules live in the air, they become harder to argue with because nobody admits they made them. A woman could wear a little colour in a private room with the curtains half closed. She could add a touch of soot to a lash line and feel like she owned her own face for a moment. But the moment she stepped toward a church door, that same touch could become a sign of intention. And intention was what society feared most, because eye makeup, more than any other ornament, was believed to send a message. Eyes were not just eyes, they were windows, and if a window looked decorated, people assumed someone wanted to be seen through it. You can almost imagine the rhythm of a Sunday morning. Slow bells, damp streets, heavy coats, and the quiet line of women moving forward. Faces kept calm, voices kept low, hands tucked inside fabric. In that line, a woman who looked too bright, too polished, too scented, could feel every gaze land like a pin. Not a shout, not a confrontation, just a steady pressure, like a hand placed gently but firmly on the back. And this is where the strange contradiction begins, because the same society that demanded women look pleasant also demanded they look humble. A woman had to appear well kept, but never appear as if she tried. She had to seem naturally lovely, in an era when natural was almost never the goal. So women learned a language of invisibility. They learned ways to do things without looking like they did anything. They learned almost colours and almost shine. They learned to tint, not paint. They learned to blur the line between care and vanity. A little beet juice, pressed into the cheeks, then wiped away quickly. A tiny touch of charcoal on the lashes, then rubbed softly in so that it looked like shadow, not makeup. A lip salve made from wax and a hint of rose, then dabbed down until the mouth looked awake, but not bold. In quiet homes, these routines could feel like prayer, not because they were holy, but because they required focus. A woman leaned closer to a small mirror, or sometimes to polished metal, or sometimes to the dark surface of water in a bowl. She held her breath, and for a moment the world narrowed into a single task. A steady hand, a soft cloth, a tiny pot of colour, and still, the fear remained. Not fear of the product, but fear of the meaning people would assign to it. If your cheeks were too red, someone might say you were fast. If your lips were too dark, someone might say you were looking. If your eyes were too defined, someone might say you were calling. So the rules were not about pigments, they were about permission. Who was allowed to be noticed? And in which room? In many towns, theatre women, dancers, performers lived on the edge of the system. On stage, the face needed definition. The audience sat far away, and candlelight swallowed features. Without bold lines, the performer became a pale blur. So they painted, and they painted with confidence. They used stronger rouge, darker kohl, brighter powders. Their faces had to read from a distance, and their faces did read clearly, loudly, unmistakably. But outside the theatre, those same faces were judged with a different scale. The stage allowed one set of rules, the street allowed another, and the church allowed almost none. The same woman could be admired at night and condemned in daylight. And that is how makeup turned into a marker of class, not just a marker of style, because wealthy women could hide their rituals. They had private rooms, servants, small jars kept in locked drawers. They had time, and they had space, and they could choose when to be seen. Poor women often had neither. They might share rooms, share water, share light. Their beauty routines had to happen quickly, in public corners, in half shadows. And what is done in public is easier to accuse. So society created a cruel equation. When the rich did it, it was refinement. When the poor did it, it was shamelessness. The action stayed the same, only the interpretation changed. In some Victorian households, even speaking openly about makeup felt improper. The products existed, but they were wrapped in euphemisms. A jar might be called a cream. A tint might be called a balm. A powder might be called a protective dust. And the act of applying it was treated like a secret. Not because the secret was dangerous, but because the secret was evidence. Evidence that beauty was not effortless. In letters and diaries, you sometimes find small hints. A woman mentions freshening up. Another mentions restoring colour. Another mentions tidying the lashes. The words avoid the truth, while still pointing toward it. And yet, markets were full of quietly labelled solutions. Small bottles, small papers, small boxes. Vendors sold complexion wafers. They sold rouge papers you could press against the cheek. They sold powders that promised pureness. They sold lotions that promised softness. The packaging itself became a performance. It promised modesty, while delivering transformation. And behind every promise, there was the deeper fear of time. Because beauty standards were not only about morality, they were also about age. Youth was praised, but not for its own sake. Youth was praised because it looked like purity. Smooth skin, clear eyes, bright cheeks were seen as signs that the body had not yet been touched by hardship. So women tried to protect the illusion of untouchedness, even when life touched them every day. A little powder to blur fatigue, a little salve to soften lips cracked by wind, a little scent to cover smoke from the hearth. Sometimes it was not vanity, it was survival. Now imagine the same era, but we'll shift the scene slightly. Not a church doorway, not a theatre stage, but a drawing room, late afternoon. Heavy curtains, a soft chair, a small table with a tray. On the tray, the brush, a powder puff, a tiny glass pot with a lid. The woman in that room, though, does not look like she is making herself up. She looks like she is preparing. Preparation sounds responsible. Preparation sounds respectable. It sounds like duty. And duty was the safe word. Women were expected to represent their families. A calm face, a composed expression, a controlled appearance. The body was seen as a message board, and the family's honour was written on it in small details. So a woman learned to manage details, like a librarian managing books. Nothing too loud, nothing too careless, everything placed where it should be. Even the famous beauty patches in earlier centuries, those small pieces of fabric placed on the face, followed this logic. A patch could hide a blemish, but it could also signal fashion. It could be a playful mark, but it could also be coded. Placed near the mouth, it might suggest flirtation. Placed near the eye, it might suggest mystery. Placed on the cheek, it might suggest charm. People argued about these meanings, and in arguing, they kept the system alive. A woman's face became a map, and everyone pretended they knew how to read it. And still, beneath all that, there was the simplest truth. People wanted to feel good in their own skin. They wanted to feel ready. They wanted a small moment of control in a world that offered them so little. Even in strict religious settings, women found small spaces, maybe a clear balm that added shine without colour, maybe a powder so pale it looked like nothing, while still smoothing texture, maybe a touch of fragrance hidden on the wrist, under a sleeve. Because hiding was also an art, and the era taught women to become artists of hiding. When you look closely and you begin to see how beauty routines mirrored the architecture of the time, the homes were layered, rooms inside rooms, curtains inside curtains, private spaces protected by doors. The face was the same, layers, a base, a dust, a tint, a pat, nothing dramatic, just careful, just quiet. And in that quiet, a woman could feel something like ownership, but the ownership was fragile. It depended on nobody naming it. If you name the routine, you admit you tried, and trying was where society placed its suspicion. So women often performed a strange trick. They did the work, then acted as if the work did not happen. They accepted compliments, as if surprised. They smiled, as if they had no idea why someone found them lovely. A compliment was safest when it seemed like fate, not effort. And then there is the issue of men. Not all men, not every man, but the social expectation of the male gaze shaped the rules anyway. In many circles, a man's face was allowed to be plain. A man could age and be called distinguished. A man could look tired and be called serious. A woman did not get those words so easily. Tired became neglect. Age became loss. Plain became failure. So women carried the burden of representing beauty for the whole society, while being punished for seeming like they wanted it. That is the kind of contradiction that makes a person quiet, and you can feel it in the small gestures. A woman turning slightly away when she blushes. A woman lowering her eyes when someone praises her looks. A woman saying, "Oh, it's nothing though," while knowing it took time, knowing it took care, knowing it took effort. Now return again to the church doorway, because it is there that the contradiction becomes sharp. The church asked for humility, but society asked women to be pleasing. The church asked for inward focus, but society watched faces closely. So women learned to make their beauty look like modesty. They chose pale tones, soft textures. They avoided shimmer, they avoided shine, they avoided anything that looked like a decision. And still, sometimes, a woman wanted a decision. Sometimes she wanted to be bold just once. Maybe not in church, maybe at a private gathering, maybe at a winter ball where candlelight flickered and music softened everything. In those spaces, stronger makeup appeared, deeper rouge, darker kohl, heavier powder, more perfume, not always tasteful, not always comfortable, but meaningful. Because boldness in a controlled life feels like air, and then the moment ends, the candle burns down, the guests leave. The woman returns to her room, the pins come out, the dress loosens, the face is wiped, and that wiping can feel like undoing a self. A warm cloth, a bit of soap, if she dares, or maybe just oil and a soft rag, a careful removal, layers disappearing, a face underneath, quieter, more human, less message. And it is there in that quiet face that you can see the truth of the era. Beauty was not only decoration, it was a role. It was a kind of clothing worn on the skin, just like corsets shape the waist, rules shape the face. Now imagine you're standing in a small shop, shelves lined with tiny jars, glass bottles catching light, labels written in careful script, a woman behind the counter, calm hands, polite smile. She does not call her products makeup, she calls them preparations, she calls them complexion aids, she calls them healthful tints. Everything is framed as health, because health is respectable. So blush becomes circulation, powder becomes protection, lip colour becomes warming the complexion. Even the language is a disguise, and many women accepted this disguise, because it let them breathe inside the rules. If beauty could be called health, then beauty could be allowed. But of course, not all products were gentle. Many were harsh. Some contained metals, some contained poisons, not always intentionally, sometimes through ignorance, sometimes through greed. The face might look smooth, while the skin underneath suffered. The era loved surfaces, sometimes at the expense of bodies, and still the demand did not soften. Because beauty standards rarely soften. They move, they shift, they change shape, but they keep pressure. One decade wants paleness, another wants a little rose. One decade wants thin eyebrows, another wants fuller brows. One decade wants an untouched face, another wants a face that looks fresh. The pressure stays, only the target moves. And women constantly adjust. That adjustment becomes part of daily life. It becomes normal. It becomes like tying your shoes. A small act done without thinking, until you realise someone taught you how, and someone judged you if you did not. Now, think again of the young woman with the tiny mirror, drawing a black line near her lashes. She is not thinking about rebellion. She is thinking about feeling awake. She is thinking about looking alive. She is thinking about not disappearing. And her mother's reaction is not only about religion, it is about fear. Fear of judgment, fear of gossip, fear of how one small line could change how the world treats her daughter. So the mother grabs the arm, not as a villain, but as a person trained by the same system, and the daughter wipes the makeup off, not because she suddenly agrees, but because she is tired. Tired of being noticed for the wrong reasons. In a calm history like this, you start to see the pattern. Beauty rituals are rarely just rituals. They are negotiations between self and society, between desire and permission, between comfort and approval. And the most powerful part is that these negotiations happen quietly, not in loud fights, but in small choices. A woman choosing the palest powder, a woman choosing not to wear scent, a woman choosing to wear scent, but only under gloves, a woman choosing a darker lip, then blotting it down, a woman choosing to leave her face bare, then feeling judged, then choosing a balm again the next day. And because the choices repeat, they become a rhythm that can lull you, the way repetitive tasks lull you, the way brushing hair, folding cloths, smoothing fabric can quiet the mind. That is why, even in strict eras, beauty rituals could feel calming. They gave structure, they gave routine, they gave a sense of beginning. Morning begins with a face, evening ends with removing the face. And in that opening and closing, a woman could find a private moment, even when privacy was rare. Now, if you let the scene widen, you can also see how beauty and religion were not always enemies. In some settings, a clean face, a carefully arranged hairline, a modest scent could be seen as honouring God, not offending him. The difference lay in emphasis. A gentle presentation could be framed as respect, a loud presentation could be framed as pride. So women learned to keep everything gentle. Gentle colours, gentle lines, gentle shine. And that gentleness became its own style, its own quiet signature of the era. Even today, you can recognise it in portraits. faces that seem soft but intentional, features that seem natural but controlled, eyes that are defined but not too defined, lips that look warm but not too warm. The portrait does not show the jars or the cloths or the whispered advice between mother and daughter, but the portrait carries the outcome like a final page, and behind that final page there were countless mornings with tiny mirrors, with careful hands, with small decisions. This is where the story can drift into another room, another ritual, another quiet pressure. Because once you understand the eyeline, you begin to notice the brow. Once you notice the brow, you notice the skin tone. Once you notice the skin tone, you notice the neck, the hands, the gloves, the scent, the hair. Everything becomes connected, and the most interesting part is how each detail could be used to tell the same message. I belong, I am proper, I am acceptable, or sometimes in private, a different message. I exist, I feel, I choose. So the next time you imagine that era pure, do not imagine only strict rules and stern faces. Imagine also the small softness of the tiny jars, the warm cloth, or the quiet breath held in front of a mirror. Imagine the way a woman might pause after finishing and simply look at herself, not to judge but to recognize. A brief moment where the world is not in the room, and then footsteps in the hallway, a voice calling, a door opening, and the world returns. The face becomes a mask, again gentle, acceptable, carefully arranged, and the day begins with bells in the distance, with fabric rustling, with the soft scent of powder, and the quiet knowledge that even a simple eyeline can carry the weight of an entire society. Emphasizing the eyes was seen as trying to attract attention and was considered sinful. In that period, a woman applying kohl around her eyes or making her lashes stand out could be perceived as a sign of moral looseness. In the Victorian era, things became more complicated. From the outside, it looked like a conservative religious society, yet working women in the lower classes, especially in entertainment houses, theatres, stage arts, made makeup a part of their identity. But eye makeup was still a bold step, because the eye was seen as the gate to the soul, and decorating it meant the intention was becoming unclear. If a woman wore eye makeup, the question appeared automatically, for whom? And if she was going to church, the reaction became much stronger, because a place of worship was considered a space of purity, humility, and inwardness, so physical decoration felt almost like mockery. Society split a woman in two the moment it saw her with her eye makeup. Either she is light or she is in heedlessness. It was as if there was no third option. But the issue was not only makeup, it was a woman's desire to have a say over her own body. A woman who defined her eyes wanted to be seen, and in that era's social order, that was dangerous, because a woman being visible could awaken desire, and desire could mean the order would break. So even small touches, like eye makeup, were called rebellious. What is interesting is that noble women did eye makeup secretly and showed it only at private balls or closed invitations. In the same society, the same act could be both sin and a beauty standard, and it also turned into a class division. If the rich did it, it was refinement. If the poor did it, it was immorality. In church, none of it was acceptable. Over time, this created contradictions inside women. They wanted to add colour to their eyes, but they feared being seen. They wanted to express themselves, but they were taught to be silent, because only men were allowed to look. Women were supposed to exist, only enough to be looked at. And today, what has changed? Maybe techniques, colours and products improved, but some of those old judgments still live. A woman's reason for makeup is still questioned. Who are you dressing up for? Is still asked. A woman without makeup is called careless. A woman with makeup is called attention-seeking, but in truth, eye makeup is a choice, an outward form of expression. For some, it is power. For some, it is art. For some, it is an ordinary routine, not a sin, not an obligation. Only about how a person wants to see themselves. And maybe the real issue is this. When someone looks into the mirror, what do they see? Imagine you are a guest of a great dynasty. You sit at a dazzling table, candles burn, music hums slowly. Then the lady of the house smiles, but something is strange. Her teeth are jet black, lined like dark pearls. She smiles, and you freeze. Is this a disease, you think? But at that moment, she is presenting herself as her most beautiful self. Because for her, those black teeth are an expression of wealth, the echo of nobility inside a smile. Many things that look like flaws today were once seen as signs of splendor, beauty, even morality. Blackened teeth were one of them. In some periods and cultures across Asia and Europe, bright white teeth were seen as a symbol of poverty, plainness, even wildness. While black teeth could symbolize a married woman's loyalty to her home, her husband, her place in society, white teeth could be interpreted as the sign of youth, purity, and being unmarried. And this was not limited to Japan. In the Victorian era, dental aesthetics also became a debated area in Europe. Teeth that were too white were associated in some circles with peasantry, outdoor life, and a rough, plain way of living. Teeth that were not bright, especially for women, were almost equal to elegance, because it implied that you did not eat often, that you did not laugh constantly, and that you did not talk too much either. But black teeth were connected not only to aesthetics, but also to health. In some regions, the mixture used to darken teeth contained iron, sulfate, and similar substances, and because it could reduce tooth decay, it was even seen as beneficial. So the dark smile gained meaning, for both symbolic and practical reasons. Why did people do this? Because the beauty codes of that era were the exact opposite of today's obsession with natural beauty. What was natural was seen as raw. Intervention from the outside was not artificiality. It was a sign of care and status. Someone who blackened their teeth was saying, "I have the money and knowledge for this process." At the same time, these people often held a respected position in society, and this difference gave them visibility. Not everyone liked this practice, of course. Over time, especially in regions where Western influence increased, the habit was mocked. As modernization spread and white teeth became a symbol of cleanliness and progress, black smiles turned into a source of shame. But that did not reduce the value of the intention in the past. Like every tradition, this one gained meaning through the norms of its own era. If someone blackened their teeth today, it would probably be seen as ugly or against smile aesthetics. But if that same person had lived years ago, they might have been accepted among nobles. Because aesthetics is not as universal as we think. It changes constantly, shaped by time, society, and even belief. In one era, gold teeth could be precious. In another, jet black teeth could be admired. Imagine it. There was an obsession like today's white teeth obsession, but in the opposite direction. And people were willing to suffer for it, willing to use special mixtures for days. And behind that smile, there were not only ideas of beauty, but deep social meanings like belonging, marriage, maturity, and wealth. Maybe that is why things that look strange to us now were deeply meaningful for people then. And what falls on us is to try to understand these details before judging them, because every smile is shaped inside its time, and every colour tells a story. Imagine a tired man. He has worked all day, and he's returning home. At home, a letter is waiting for him. He's been invited. Tonight, he will attend the most respected ball of the era, As he dresses, he looks in the mirror, adjusts his tie, brushes his jacket, combs his hair back. But what truly catches his attention is his wife's appearance, with her thin waist, her puffed skirt, her corset that runs down to her back. She stands before him like a statue. She smiles, but she cannot breathe. This is not beauty, it is difficulty. All night long, it will not be their conversations that are heard, but their breathing. Because that night, a visual spectacle will be presented. A body built by clothing. The Victorian era was one of the ages when beauty was created not from nature, but from illusion. What plastic surgeons do today, the tailors and fashion makers of that time did with fabric, stitching, tightening. Bodies were shaped not to reflect reality, but to match the aesthetic codes of the period. Every woman had to be graceful, but that grace never came from the natural form of the body. Corsets were the most well-known tools, supported with iron boning, standing inside the fabric like ribs. These garments could narrow a woman's waist down to 40 centimetres. This was not only a matter of appearance. Women could not eat in these clothes, could not walk comfortably, and sometimes they were squeezed so tightly they fainted. The question, why did women always faint, even appeared in medical books for a time. The truth was inside the clothing. But it was not only for women. Men also built their social identities, with fake shoulder pads, canes and perfumes. In those days, a gentleman was measured by the care he gave to his appearance. If his hat was crooked, if his trousers were wrinkled, if his collar was dirty, he could be accused not only of poor taste, but of moral decline. Women wore several layers of undergarments beneath puffed skirts, and had special pieces tailored to make hips look larger and the torso look narrower. With some garments, sitting was impossible, because when you sat, your skirt collapsed, and your corset stabbed into your ribs, but no one cared about that. What mattered was to look that way. Another interesting side of this false beauty was how clearly it separated classes. Bodies created by clothing were perfect for telling rich from poor at first glance. A peasant woman's waist was thick, her hands were calloused. A city woman's waist had to look like a swan, her fingers like a violin bow. The difference had to be drawn not only with income, but with the body itself. These clothing-built bodies became so common that people grew unfamiliar with naked bodies. The real body could be seen only in the bath or in front of a doctor. Some men even went into shock when they saw their wives for the first time on the night they undressed, because the aesthetic illusion was so strong that women had become almost architectural works. In this era, a beautiful body meant not the natural one, but the compressed, pressed, lifted, hidden body. Maybe your chest was small, but a dress could make it look large. Maybe your hips were flat, but padding could raise them. Maybe your stomach protruded, but a corset could flatten it. And at the end of it all, what appeared was a beauty standard that no one truly had. But this illusion had a cost. Shortness of breath, organs being compressed, digestion problems, spinal curves. Corsets may have become popular again today as an aesthetic product, but historically, they were symbols of pain endured for beauty. And in this age of false beauty, people hid not only their bodies, but also their selves. Because everyone's identity was measured by skirt length, waist thinness, hat angle, the truth under the image did not matter. Today, maybe we're not so different. With filters, apps, makeup, we try to make ourselves beautiful, but we should remember this cycle is not more new, only the tools changed. What the corset was then, Photoshop is today, and maybe that is why. Understanding the bodies built by clothing in the past helps us see today's aesthetic pressures more clearly. A young girl walking on rainy London streets one morning, the hem of her skirt stained with mud. The sky is grey, the wind cuts her face, but there is a strange liveliness on her face. Her cheeks are bright red, her lips are dark pink, close to purple. A man passing by lifts his head and looks at her. Then another one. The girl smiles, but the smile is not sincere. Those colourful cheeks are not the result of healthy skin, but of a chemical mixture she applies, without knowing what it contains. No one knows. That girl is slowly poisoning herself every day for beauty. In the Victorian era, looking healthy was a sign that you came from a good family, that you ate clean, that you were close to nobility. Paleness meant illness. Colour meant vitality. But the interesting thing was that this vitality was often not real. It was artificial. If there was no natural blush, what would they do? Of course, makeup. But this makeup was not innocent, like today's foundation. To give cheeks a lively colour, compounds containing mercury and lead-based pigments were used. To make lips look darker, insect extracts, arsenic lip colours, and sometimes cloth pieces soaked in wine were rubbed onto lips. Women became chemical laboratories for their beauty without being chemists. One of the most popular mixtures for cheeks was rouge. The French word itself meant red. Inside it, there could be iron oxide or cinnabar, a mercury compound. In the short term, these created a pleasant redness. In the long term, they irritated skin, caused peeling, flaking, and even permanent damage. How ironic. While trying to look healthy, poison was being worked under the skin. Lip pigments were not innocent either. To achieve darker and more lasting colours, cosmetic makers used mixtures of purple mustard extract, lead acetate, and arsenic. Some women mixed beeswax and animal fat to make lips appear shinier. Even if these mixtures melted and dripped during the day, no one cared, because appearance was more important than health. Makeup was not only beauty, it was also a sign of status. A pale face could remind people of a servant working at home. A woman with red cheeks and dark lips was the society woman, dancing at balls, receiving guests, drawing attention. So aesthetics was not only aesthetics, it was a social calling card. Some women exaggerated their blush, rubbing beet juice or raspberry juice directly on the face. It looked natural, but if left on the skin too long, it caused irritation. Still, that painful beauty was accepted as a price worth paying, because everything was for looking alive. What you were living inside did not matter. The colour on your skin crushed the truth. Interestingly, some women tried to raise their own blood pressure through physical effort. They climbed stairs, walked fast, slapped their own cheeks, so they could achieve a natural redness, because they wanted to look real. Even that realness was the result of an artificial effort. Over time, these chemical makeups began to threaten women's health. Stains that would not fade, nervous system disorders, headaches, even miscarriages. But the problem was not only a beauty product, it was a social expectation. Because women were not given the task of being beautiful, they were given the task of looking beautiful, no matter the cost. For men, red cheeks often signaled drunkenness or too much sun, so makeup belonged only to women. Men were naturals. Women had to be processed. Another layer of cultural pressure placed on women's bodies, because even a woman's existence had to pass an aesthetic exam. Today, red cheeks and purple lips can still suggest vitality to us, but in the past, there was another story behind those colours. Skin stained with lead, nerves damaged by arsenic, bodies worn down by mercury. So let us ask ourselves again, was beauty really being healthy, or was it believing unhealthy things were beauty? Maybe the real illness was normalising self-poisoning for the sake of appearance. A young woman in her 20s. Her name is Eleanor. Every morning she wakes up, combs her hair with her fingers, feels her face with her hands. There is no mirror in her room, no clean bowl of water to see a reflection. She cannot see her face. She only senses that something is missing, from her mother's disapproving lips, from the whispers of neighbouring women, from the men in the market who avoid looking. Because in Victorian London, beauty was measured not with the eyes, but with the tongue. There was no mirror, but there were endless comments. In today's world, mirrors are often the subject of beauty. You look at yourself, but you decide for yourself. But in the Victorian era, many women had no access to mirrors. And if you were from the lower class, owning a mirror was a luxury. And those who had money kept mirrors covered, because looking too much was considered vanity. So a woman's ability to feel beautiful was shaped by what others said about her. Beauty was a judgment, a label that came from someone else's lips and sank into a woman's mind. The beauty ideal of society was single, strict, white skin, small nose, thin waist, low voice, but those ideals were cruel to those who were not born with them. Eleanor, like thousands of women, measured herself by other people's words. Your cheeks are too full, your hair is too dark, your eyebrows are thick. Beauty was shaped by criticism. The mirror did not show anything, but everyone still said what they wanted to say. For men, beauty was not a need, it was a detail. For women, it was the condition of existence. When Eleanor went to the market, she was not only choosing fruit, she was also weighing whether she was beautiful in the eyes of a grocer who looked at her and fixed his moustache. When a florist woman said, "My girl, I wish you would wear a little blush," a needle went into Eleanor's heart, because beauty was equal to respect. The beautiful one was listened to more, judged less. Women slowly withdrew into themselves without seeing themselves. They began to imagine their own faces, and these imaginations were shaped by the comments they heard. If one day someone said, "You have such sweet eyes," she would believe her eyes were beautiful. But the next day, if someone said, "Your nose is a bit big," that belief began to crack. So women built their own faces out of other people's sentences. It was fragile and far from reality. Over time, beauty began to form through comparison as well. When Eleanor went to her cousin's wedding, she looked at other women and counted her own missing parts. Her dress is brighter, her hair is neater, her smile is more graceful. Beauty was now not only a comment, but also a comparison. Every woman feared being less beside another, because society had turned beauty into a race, depending on comments instead of a mirror, destroyed confidence. Women adjusted their value according to outside voices. Someone who can look in the mirror today and say, "I am beautiful," would not have dared to think that back then, because self-admiration was a sin and acceptance was a virtue. Even if Eleanor felt beautiful one day, she could not share it with anyone, because there was no mirror, but there was judgment. There were comments, and those comments did not allow a woman to be honest even with herself. Most painfully, the definition of beauty was set by men and applied by women. Women judged one another through the male gaze, and men's words became the norm. So millions of women like Eleanor were never beautiful for themselves. They struggled for someone else's approval. In the end, Eleanor placed a mirror into her mirrorless years one day. But when she looked into it, she did not see herself. She saw the sentences she had heard. Her mother's dissatisfied look, the grocer's indifference, the neighbour's jealous comment. The mirror was not just glass, it was a curtain where all the words of the past gathered. Eleanor saw not her own face, but the face society assigned to her. And if you have come this far, you have probably noticed it too. Beauty does not always begin in a mirror. Sometimes people's tongues and gazes and silences become the strongest mirror. But when those mirrors break, what remains behind? Another life history channel. Tonight we travelled into the most hidden corners of the past, If you enjoyed this narration, you can support us by using the thank you button under the video, and you can share in the comments interesting beauty rituals you know from history. See you again in new stories. Close your eyes, we will keep telling. Good night.